I've mentioned many times on this channel before that 35mm focal length is my favorite focal length. So when Laowa asked if I want to check out their latest Argus 35mm f/0.95 lens, I said yes before they could even finish their sentence. So here you go, the fastest full-frame 35mm lens in the world and also the widest full-frame f/0.95 lens as well. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard here, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at the Laowa Argus 35mm f/0.95 lens. I am really excited about this lens for many reasons, but let's have a look and see if this lens has met my expectation or not. This Laowa 35mm f/0.95 is a full-frame lens that is specially designed for mirrorless cameras. It is fully mechanical and there's no electronic support and there's no autofocus as well. This lens is available for Sony E, Nikon Z and Canon R mount. If you are a L mount shooter and wondering why there's no L mount version, I asked the same question too, and I even asked the Laowa designer Mr. Lee directly, and he told me it's purely because the rear extruded design of the lens wouldn't work with the L mount, so there's not enough space for them to make a L mount version. So unfortunately, you won't see a L mount version of this lens. This is a full metal construction lens and it's quite a large and heavy lens as well. The weight of this lens is around 755 grams. So last night I went out with this lens and I mounted on the Nikon Z6 and I did a 2-hour walk around the city just holding the camera because normally I don't use any camera strap. So my fingers definitely felt a bit sore after the photo walk. But remember, it is a full frame f/0.95 lens, so the size and weight of this lens is still quite reasonable. The lens comes with a removable lens hood and the front filter thread is 72mm. The focus ring is at the front of the lens and the focus ring feels very smooth and also very well dampened. The focus throw is very long, it's around 270 degrees. Usually I like long focus throw, especially for an ultra fast main focus lens like this Argus lens, so that you can have precise focus control. But I still think 270 degrees may be a little bit too long. For example, if I want to change the focus from 0.5 meter to 3 meter, I have to keep turning and turn quite a few times before I can reach 3 meter. So maybe a little bit shorter focus throw, maybe 180 degrees could be slightly better. While I may not 100% like the design of the focus ring, the aperture ring is a different story. I remember one of the things that I didn't really like when I was reviewing the Argus 33mm APS-C lens was the aperture ring, which is declicked. I think that was not a very good choice because I think a lot of photographers would want to buy that lens. So I even talked to Laowa about it many times and they promised me that they will look into that for their future Argus lens. So this time with this 35mm Argus lens, the aperture ring now has a switch there, so you can choose between having clicks or declicked with your aperture ring. So for me, I definitely enable the clicks, and when I do that, the aperture ring feel absolutely fantastic. I really love the feedback from the aperture ring when I'm going through the clicks. But of course, if you prefer to have a smooth, clickless aperture ring, you can choose to have that as well. Just like the 33mm Argus lens, this 35mm Argus lens is also an internal focus lens, so when you adjust the focus, the length of the lens does not change. If you're wondering what does f/0.95 aperture give you, here is a set of photos I shot at different aperture value, starting from the minimum aperture f16 all the way to the maximum aperture f/0.95. Not only the depth of field would change dramatically as I change the aperture value, the ISO I shot at is also become much lower once I move down to f0.95. Even just compare the photo I shot at f1.4 and f0.95, the ISO is one stop lower at f0.95, and that will allow you to have cleaner image when you are shooting photo under low light. This Laowa Argus lens has the minimum focus distance of 0.5 meter, and that will give you maximum magnification of 0.1 time. So while it's not a really high magnification, it didn't stop me from having some fun with the lens and did some toy photography with this lens. So check out my other video after you finish watching this one. In the other video, I show you how I did some toy photography using this Laowa lens. But there's something more you also need to be aware of when shooting at the minimum focus distance, but I'll talk about that in the next session. Okay, now let's have a look at the image quality, and as usual, let's start with the image sharpness. At the maximum aperture f0.95, the center sharpness is already pretty good. But if I stop down to f1.4, then the center would become quite a bit sharper. And the maximum center sharpness of this lens appears to be around f4. Okay, now let's have a look at the corner. At the maximum aperture, the corner is quite soft. Stop down to f2 and the corner become a lot sharper. And I would say it is very usable even if the corner sharpness is very important for you. And just like the center, the maximum corner sharpness is at around f4. When you are shooting at or near the minimum focus distance, the image could be quite soft. Even if you look at the center of this photo shot at f0.95, you can see there is quite a bit of glow around the high contrast area. Stop down to around f1.4 would get rid of most of those glow effect, and at f2, now the center become very sharp. To me, I think this is not really a big issue because when you're shooting at the minimum focus distance, the depth of field is so narrow. So unless you are also shooting a test chart photo like me, otherwise you probably have to stop down a bit to get a little bit more depth of field so your subject could be in focus. Okay, now let's have a look at the bokeh. When shooting at the maximum aperture, there's quite a bit of bokeh clipping and also cat's eye effect near the edge of the frame. It's not like super swirly bokeh like a Helios 44 lens, but the cat's eye effect is definitely noticeable, especially when you are taking more close-up photos. If you don't like that, you need to stop down the lens to around f2, then you can get rid of most of those effects. The bokeh balls could also have a little bit of halo ring at the edge. It's not very serious, but if you zoom in the photo, you will see it. When you stop down the lens, the bokeh balls still remain very round and smooth thanks to the 15 aperture braid design. Bokeh from this lens definitely has a bit of special character. There's some strong vignetting at f0.95, which is quite common for a ultra fast lens. Stop down to f1.4 would improve vignetting quite a bit, but you do need to stop down the lens to around f2.8 to make vignetting not that noticeable. In terms of chromatic aberration, most of my real-world photos, I don't see much color fringing, but in my high contrast test photos like this one, I do see a bit of color fringing. But the amount of chromatic aberration I feel is still quite acceptable. My local test photo also shows a small amount of color fringing, so overall I think for a f0.95 lens, I'm still quite happy with this lens chromatic aberration control. Now let's have a look at this brick wall test photo. I can see a small amount of distortion, but it's quite minor. So while it's not a ZOD lens, I think the distortion control is good with this Laowa Argus lens. If you have watched my Laowa Argus 33mm f0.95 lens review, you probably remember that APS-C lens has quite a lot of lens flare. When shooting at wide open, you would quite often see some bright red color ring flare very easily when there's a strong light source in front of the camera. With this Argus 35mm lens, I have some good and bad news for you. The good news is, lens flare is much better controlled with this Argus 35mm lens. When shooting into the sun on a sunny day, there is only very small amount of lens flare. And when shooting at night, when there's some strong light source, I do see more lens flare. Stop down to f1.2 could get rid of large amount of lens flare. Overall, it is much better control compared to the Argus 33mm, and I think it is better than most f0.95 lens that I have tested as well. But on the other hand, what is the bad news? We no longer have that beautiful looking red color ring flare that the Argus 33mm lens has. The lens flare from this 35mm lens looks okay, but is definitely not as cinematic as the Argus 33mm lens. At least that's what I thought. Usually with the wide angle Laowa lenses, they love to use the 5 aperture braid design, which give you some really beautiful 10-point sunstars, but that would sacrifice the bokeh, as the bokeh would turn into pentagon shape as soon as you stop down the lens even just a little bit. So with this Argus lens, Laowa choose a 15 aperture braid design, which deliver nice and round bokeh balls even if you stop down the lens a little bit, as we have seen just before. But what about the sunstars? Starting from f5.6, sunstars become quite easy to spot in the photo, and if you stop down the lens further and at the minimum aperture f16, the sunstars is now very sharp and very clean. Because of the 15 aperture braid, the sunstars are 30 points. If you ask me, I think I still prefer the sunstars from the 5 aperture braid Laowa lenses, but the sunstars from this Argus lens still look quite decent to me. A 35mm f0.95 lens could be a dream lens for astrophotography. So let's have a look at this Argus lens chroma performance. This is the photo I shot at the maximum aperture f0.95. Because of the ultra fast aperture, I shot this photo at ISO 3600 at 1 second shutter speed. This allowed me to get cleaner image compared to a f2 or even f1.4 lens. Now, if we zoom into the photo at 200% and look at the corner, I can see quite a bit of chroma at the corner of the frame. But to be fair, for a full frame f0.95 lens that is under $900, it is not bad. If you stop down to f2, then you can reduce the amount of chroma quite a bit, but not completely removing it. Focus breathing is quite well controlled. Have a look at this footage when I change the focus from around 1.5 meter to infinity. You can see focus breathing, but I think the amount is quite small. Many of you would know I love ultra fast lenses and I love shooting with them at the maximum aperture, and that's exactly what I did when I was reviewing this lens. Most of the photos and video I shot were at f0.95 or near that, as it really brings out the character of this Laowa Argus lens. I would love to use this lens as an everyday lens, as I love the 35mm focal length, and the f0.95 aperture not only allows me to separate my subject from the background very easily, but I can also shoot at really dark places without needing to have a tripod. However, as an everyday lens, this is not a small or lightweight setup at all. So you need to keep that in mind if you are thinking of getting it as your everyday lens. In terms of image quality, for a full frame f0.95 lens that is less than $900, there will be compromises. Quite a lot of compromises. Otherwise, the Nikon 58 f0.95 log lens, which is, by the way, also a main focus lens and also quite a bit bigger and heavier than this Laowa lens, the Nikon wouldn't cost $8,000. So this Laowa Argus lens is only like 10% the price of the Nikon lens. With that in mind, I think Laowa did a very good job, as this lens delivers Overall, quite decent image quality even when you are shooting at the maximum aperture. Yes, there are a few limitations. For example, the image is soft when shooting at the minimum focus distance at f0.95 or the amount of vignetting, but I don't think any of these are deal breaker if you are interested in this lens. The thing that I don't like the most is actually the long focus throw when you have to change the focus distance. For example, between minimum focus distance and 3 meters, you have to keep turning and turning the focus ring. But again, it is not a deal breaker, and this is pretty much the only thing that I would complain about this lens. It's more like if you let me choose, I would choose to have a slightly shorter focus throw. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review, and if you have any question about this lens, just drop a comment below. Thank you very much for watching this review, and remember, I have another video, a toy photography video that I shot the photos using this Laowa Argus 35mm f0.95 lens.